When I asked Paige Sawyer if he would be willing to give a talk here, he went through a Rolodex. He said, sure thing. He's always very generous, sure thing. And he went through a veritable Rolodex of topics. He's got so many to choose from, different talks he's prepared. And this one's a great one by George. I didn't know that. All these sort of hidden histories, things we don't know about Georgetown. He knows them. He's an expert. He's a historian. He's a photographer. But he's also someone his family has roots that go so deep into South Carolina before it was South Carolina officially, 7 generations deep. From the 1750s in the Edgefield County area. And I know most of us here know who he is, the ever popular Paige Sawyer. So let's welcome him in with a big round of applause.
Well, thank you, Bud. Man, you make me sound good. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate everybody being here. Unfortunately, these two ladies here, they know me, and so I'll try not to tell too many lies that they can discount. I want everybody to know that you're not, hey, Ken, I know him too, and somebody on the back row also. I want y'all, and Tom also over here too. I want y'all to know that I am not an academic historian with several postgraduate degrees from prestigious universities. As Dan said, I'm just a 7th generation South Carolinian pluff mud redneck. Hopefully you'll accept me, and we're going to talk today about, as Dan said, several tidbits of history that either happened here in Georgetown County or the city of Georgetown. Hopefully at the end of this meeting, you'll go away with the newfound knowledge of where we live and why we're blessed to be here. So let's go ahead and get started. Oh, before we do get started, I want to tell you about a poets society up in Washington, D.C. And they were losing members, so they wanted to have a contest to try to increase the membership with their poet fellows. So they sent out a questionnaire and said, we want y'all to submit a poem that the first line is romantic and the second line is the least romantic thing. And they had several hundred entries, and they chose what they thought was the best one. It says, my darling, my lover, my beautiful wife, marrying you screwed up my life. I see your face when I am dreaming. That's why I always wake up screaming. Kind, intelligent, loving, and hot. This describes everything you're not. I love your smile, your face, and your eyes. Damn, I'm good at telling lies. My feelings for you, no words can tell, except for maybe go to hell. What inspired this amazing rhyme? 2 parts tequila, 1 part lime. So, we don't have any poets in here today, do we? All right. By George, I didn't know that. We're going to start off talking about the city of Georgetown, and many of you have been there. It's only about 13, 15 miles down the road. Wonderful place to visit. And I know a lot of you, a lot of the older folks around Georgetown County, when they ask you where you're from and you say Georgetown, if they're an older folks, they'll say, oh, the Sunset Lodge. And we'll talk about the Sunset Lodge in a few minutes for those of you who do not know the Sunset Lodge. Or they will say, oh yeah, that's where I live. I can recognize that place by the smell. Or several years ago, well, let's back up. Several years ago, when we had Hurricane Matthew, Joaquin, whatever, we had a high tide, water just rained continuously, and parts of Front Street flooded. 10 years ago, we had a bad fire that destroyed several of the most historical buildings we had in Georgetown. But this old Chamber of Commerce brochure will tell you Georgetown, an interesting place to visit, a delightful place to live. Now we need to go back to 1526, Vasquez de Ayllon. He was a Spanish explorer. He explored the coast of South Carolina, and we think he established a colony on Hobcaw Barony. We can't prove it. If we could prove it, that would make Georgetown older than St. Augustine, Florida. But until we get some archaeological proof, we just have to rely on, assumptions. One of the first plants in Georgetown that the settlers were planting was indigo. Now, indigo is a shrub, a plant, that when processed will produce a dark blue dye. And indigo was a very good cash crop for the settlers because the settlers had a good market for indigo. It was Great Britain. Great Britain wanted to buy the indigo for their robes, their parliament gowns, their uniforms, Navy uniforms. You've heard navy blue, royal blue. That's where that term comes from. Now, a lady, Eliza Lucas Pinckney, she was given some indigo seeds from her father, and he said, hey, let's get this thing going good so we can make some money. He had a plantation down in Antigua, and he was growing indigo there, and he said, well, Georgetown County has subtropical weather. I think we can grow indigo here and double our money. Eliza Lucas Pinckney, she perfected the process, and after 3 seasons, she was growing indigo that was producing a dark blue dye that Great Britain wanted. If any of you have ever read The Indigo Girl, it's a historical novel about Eliza Lucas Pinckney. It's factual, but it's a novel at the same time, but it's a real good book. And in fact, Eliza Lucas Pinckney, she lived on Hampton Plantation down below Georgetown when President George Washington took a southern tour through Georgetown County in 1791. He stopped at Hampton Plantation and spent the night. Unfortunately, Eliza had breast cancer, and she was telling the president about her breast cancer, and he said, you need to go see my doctor in Philadelphia. So she made a trek up to Philadelphia. Unfortunately, she died, but guess who was one of her pallbearers? George Washington. So that's a little unknown fact about Eliza Lucas Pinckney. There are some of the gowns, the robes that the indigo was used for. True Blue Plantation right up here. It's named True Blue because of the indigo they were producing was such a dark blue that they named that plantation True Blue. The indigo planters were so wealthy, they formed the Indigo Society. And the Indigo Society met in Georgetown in this building, which is the present-day Rolling Local on the corner of Front and Broad Street. Their first president was Thomas Lynch Sr. Now, Thomas Lynch Sr. owned Hopsawee Plantation just south of Georgetown on the North Santee River. Now, that was in 1757. About 20 years later, we were fighting the Brits during the American Revolutionary War. We won, and we got a new Declaration of Independence, which made us a free country. Now, Thomas Lynch was also a delegate to the Continental Congress, and he was called to Philadelphia to sign the Declaration of Independence. Unfortunately, Thomas Lynch Sr. had a stroke and had lost his ability to write. So his son, Thomas Lynch Jr., signed the Declaration of Independence for his father, along with the 3 other signatures. And you can see there's a space right here where Thomas Lynch Sr., had he regained his ability to write, they left a space for him to sign his name there. Unfortunately, he didn't. But his home place was Hopsawee Plantation on the North Santee, just south of Georgetown. It's open today. They just started a new museum in that facility earlier this week, I believe. But the Indigo Society, they built an Indigo Hall on the corner of Prince and Queen Streets, 509 Prince, and it was to be used as a school, free school for indigent children. The only free school between Charleston and Wilmington for indigent children. Now, the Indigo Society, it was also a library until 1954. The Indigo Society is still in operation today. It's a men's social club. Membership is by invitation only, but their mission is still education. Every year in May or June, whenever the high school graduates, they give a scholarship to the valedictorian of Georgetown High School, male or female, black, white, green, purple, doesn't make any difference, and a gold medallion with the Indigo Society insignia. So their mission is still education as it was in 1757. Have any of you ever been out Winyah Bay to North Island and have seen the Georgetown Lighthouse? Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. The Georgetown Lighthouse, it was built, the first one was built in 1801 out of wood, cypress wood. It had steps going up one side. The bottom portion was painted white. The lighthouse keepers and their family lived in a cabin next door to the lighthouse. Every night at dusk, he would climb those steps, go up and light the wick with whale's oil. Well, unfortunately, that 1801 lighthouse only lasted 5 years. We had a big storm in 1806, and it blew down that structure. Well, they said, we're going to build another lighthouse, but this time we'll make it out of brick and mortar. So they built the present-day lighthouse in 1810, finished it in 1811. They didn't build it out of cypress wood again, but they built it out of brick and mortar, and it has 120 solid granite steps going around the center, which gives it even greater stability. The lighthouse keepers, they continued to live on the island until 1968. They lit the wick with whale's oil until whale's oil gave out, and then they started using lard or hog's oil. Hog's oil eventually went the way to kerosene, and kerosene eventually went the way to electricity. The lighthouse keepers, they continued to live on the island until 1968. In 1968, the Coast Guard took over the operation of the lighthouse. They stayed until 1986, and when they left, they installed a solar panel. I'm sorry, I'm a slide ahead of myself. This is the lens that came out of the Georgetown Lighthouse that was used for over 100 years. It's in the South Carolina Maritime Museum, which is in Georgetown. When the Coast Guard left, they installed a solar panel, so now the power comes from the sun. The beacon will come on at dusk, flash twice every 15 seconds, and on a clear, cold night, like last night was, it can be seen up to 15 miles out into the ocean. All right, do we have any good Methodists in the room? You don't have to tell me you recognize him if you don't. That is Francis Asbury. Francis Asbury came through Georgetown in 1785 and established the first Methodist congregation in South Carolina in Georgetown. The congregation now meets at Duncan Memorial United Methodist Church on the corner of High Market and Broad Street. First Methodist congregation in South Carolina. The oldest house of worship in Georgetown and Horry counties is Prince George Winyah. It goes back to 1721. The present sanctuary was built around 1741, finished in 1747. And today it's still right there where it was during the Revolutionary War. The soldiers, revolutionary redcoats, they occupied the church. They stabled their horses in there, and they called it a sedition shop. We've had several films filmed in Georgetown. The Notebook, The Patriot. Part of The Patriot was filmed at Mansfield Plantation. Paradise. And Tom, I know you know, and these girls know, but Shag the movie, it was filmed in part of it was filmed in Georgetown, and it premiered at Litchfield Theaters over here in 1985, I think. But for those of you who do not know, Shag is the state dance for South Carolina. It refers to a slow jitterbug, but the movie was filmed in Georgetown and parts of Myrtle Beach. And guess what was filmed 100 years ago in Georgetown? Pied Piper Malone. It was a silent movie, and it was about a ship captain who had come home. Georgetown was his home, and he had all these children. All the children were attracted to him, and they used some locals from Georgetown in the film. Unfortunately, all the locals are dead now, but a lot of the scenes were filmed in the stores in Georgetown. And I mentioned the Maritime Museum a few minutes ago. they have a display. They just put it up about 2 weeks ago on the 100th anniversary of the filming of that movie in Georgetown. 2 of these ships, this one and one down here, they were in the movie, and the person at the Georgetown Maritime Museum, he tracked down their whereabouts today, and they've got a nice display in the Maritime Museum. Now, this is an aerial view of Georgetown, and we'll try to orient yourself so you'll know where you are. This would be Debadoo up here. This would be Highway 17. This would be Hobcaw Barony over here. Coming into Georgetown, you cross over the Waccamaw River, the Black and PD rivers. You come on around. Here's the city of Georgetown right here. Highway 17 then goes south. Here's the airport. You continue on south down into Charleston County once you cross the North and South Santee rivers. Now, these 5 rivers, the Santee, the Sanpit, the Black, the PD, and the Waccamaw, 4 of those were named after Indians. Now, Winyah Bay, this is Winyah Bay. This is where the lighthouse is on North Island. Winyah Bay is the 3rd largest estuary on the East Coast. 1st largest is the Chesapeake Bay. 2nd largest is the Pamplico Sound. And this is the 3rd largest, and it's 525,000 acres. So it ain't no small thing. But 4 of these rivers flow into Winyah Bay. There are several other rivers upstate that flow into these rivers, and the watershed eventually comes out to Winyah Bay and into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, with these 5 rivers, guess who was one of the frequent travelers on those 5 rivers 250 years ago? Sir?
Blackbeard.
Blackbeard, yeah. All right, I'm glad you said that, Tommy. Blackbeard and some other pirates, they would come into Georgetown. Now, these 5 rivers, if you look at the water, if you go on the rivers, they're brown. The water's brown in color. It's brown in color because of something we call tannic acid. On the banks of those rivers are trees. The trees drop leaves, sap, and bark into the water, and that gives it a brown color. It's called tannin, T-A-N-N-I-N, tannic acid. If I had a glass of water and drop 2 tea bags in that water, after about 5 or 6 minutes, that water is going to go from clear to a light tan color. That's tannic acid. The pirates knew about that tannic acid. They would come in, they were being chased out here in the Atlantic by the Royal Navy. They would come in and go up those rivers and stay for about 2 months. And while they were there, they would take the sails down from the mast, drop them in the water, just let them soak up that tanning. And after about 2 months, they would hoist the sails back up on the mast, go back out into the ocean, and those masts went from a white color to a light tan color, and they were harder to see by the British Navy. So Tommy, you're exactly right about the pirates. But another frequent traveler on these rivers was a young man who had grown up in Georgetown. His name was Francis Marion, AKA the Swamp Fox. And he had grown up in Georgetown. The British captured Georgetown in 1780, held it for 11 months. Francis Marion made 4 attempts on getting Georgetown back from the British. Unfortunately, he didn't have enough men. The British were heavily armed. They had a fortification with cannons, and his men could not attack the fortification with that cannon. But eventually, Georgetown was relieved by the British, and Francis Marion is still considered a hero today. And we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the American Revolutionary War in just a couple of years. We do have a committee. Ken's the chairman of the committee. Excuse me, y'all. And we're going to have a blowout. So if any of you are interested in helping with the 250th committee, we'll be glad to hear you. Ken's taking names as we speak. But there are going to be some big doings here for that anniversary. The oldest fish house in South Carolina is right down on the end of St. James Street, Cathoo Fish House. The Cathoo family, they were French Huguenots. They came to Georgetown in the late 1800s. They established this fish house. It's the oldest fish house in South Carolina. Now, back during the 50s and 60s, they were well known for their caviar. Now, the caviar is a large prehistoric-looking fish that you can see jumping out in Winyah Bay. It's a big old fish, anywhere from 2 feet to about 6 feet. It'll go straight up and come right back down, and that's your sturgeon. Unfortunately, it was overfished in the 40s and 50s, and it's now, you can't go out and catch them now, but the female carried the eggs or the roe in her stomach. They were taken back to that fish house where they were processed into caviar. And if any of you, I'm sure we have some people here who are old enough to remember President John F. Kennedy. When he was inaugurated in January 1961, he specifically asked for caviar from Cthulhu's Fish House. All right, speaking of presidents, George Washington, as I mentioned earlier, he came through Georgetown in 1791. He came down, the Waccamaw River. He spent a night at one of the plantations, either Arcadia or Clifton. He crossed the river. He spent some time in Georgetown. Some people say he spent the night in Georgetown, but we can't actually document it, but everybody wants to say he slept right here. But we don't know that. In his diary, he recorded that he went to Georgetown, he spoke to the citizens, he had lunch with some people and remarked about how beautiful Georgetown had a population of about 500 to 600 people. It had suffered from the Revolutionary War. In fact, in August of 1781, the British burned 42 homes in Georgetown and a lot of the stores. So Georgetown just about got wiped out during that fire, and it took them 50 years before they could really bring the economy back up to where it was prior to that. Another president who came through Georgetown was James Monroe in 1819. He made a trip through Georgetown. He stopped at several of the plantations, went into Georgetown, and continued his trip. Another president, he actually came through Georgetown after he was president, Martin Van Buren in 1842. He came through Georgetown, and he specifically stopped at the home of White House Plantation. It's on where the Black River and the PD, where they come together. And he went to see his former ambassador to Mexico. Now, his former ambassador to Mexico was a man by the name of Joel Poinsett. Now, Joel Poinsett was also a botanist. And while he was in Mexico, he noticed this beautiful shrub that was growing. And he said, that's a pretty plant. I think I'm going to take some cuttings and take it home and see what I can do with it. So he took it home, did some experiments with it, propagated it, and I'll bet a month from now, just about every one of you will have some of these in your home or in your yard or around your decorations. The poinsettia, after it came to America, was named after Joel Poinsett. Another president, Grover Cleveland, in 1891, he was invited to a duck hunt here in Georgetown County. Now you can see he's a rather stout individual. Well, he shot a couple of ducks and the water wasn't that deep, but he stepped out of the boat to retrieve the ducks. And I mentioned pluff mud a while ago. The sediment underneath the water is pluff mud. Now pluff mud, we call it Carolina quicksand. Now you step into it, it doesn't really pull you down, but you have a heck of a time trying to pull yourself out of it. So he stepped in the pluff mud. His two guides, they were a little upset. They had to put their arms underneath each one of his arms and finally get him back in the boat. They finally got him back in the boat. They couldn't say what they wanted to because he was president. But about 3 weeks later, all the headlines in the newspapers said, President Cleveland sinks in pluff mud while shooting ducks in Georgetown. Well, to the average reader, all they read was President Cleveland shooting ducks in Georgetown. So that brought an influx of hunters to Georgetown County, not only to hunt ducks, but turkey, deer, and quail. Now, we call that the second Yankee invasion. And I mean that in good taste. Now, why don't we have a slide there? All right. Now, when I say the second Yankee invasion, a lot of wealthy Northerners came down and bought the farmer plantations. The plantations The plantation owners had lost their labor force, the slaves, during the American Civil War, the war between the states. So a lot of the plantations had gone into disrepair. Now you can see over here on the left the names and the places where where the new owners were from. There's Bernard Manus Baruch, New York. New York, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, I don't know where that is, Waverly Mills, New York, Indianapolis, New York, Titusville. Now, a lot of these wealthy Northerners, they provided income for unemployed people, black and white. They needed somebody to keep up the plantations. They needed somebody to keep the gardens growing. They needed somebody to take care of the livestock. They needed somebody to clean the house. So they brought employment to a lot of folks here in Georgetown County, and thankfully, some of those wealthy Northerners had the long-range vision to preserve what they have. So Georgetown is protected by a lot of former plantations, and here you can see they know the whole world, and this is their playground. One of those was Bernard Baruch. He bought 12 former plantations on the Waccamaw River. He did away with the individual names and gave it the name Hobcaw Barony. Hobcaw is an Indian word meaning between the waters. Now, Mr. Baruch, he entertained he was a very influential man. He had earned his first million before he was 30 years old. He was a financial advisor to 7 different presidents, and even from Woodrow Wilson up to Harry S. Truman. Even after Harry S. Truman, Presidents Kennedy and Johnson would call him and ask him a global financial question, and he could answer it over the phone. That's how smart he was. You've heard the word Cold War. He coined that word. But he was a very influential man, not only in state and local politics, but world politics. He would invite his family and friends to his home. He built this home in 1932 after the first one burned. And he said, I will never have another house that burned. He built it out of brick. It has 16 bedrooms, 14 and 1/2 bathrooms. On each corner of the lot, there's a hose with a pump that they can put in the water in case the house catches on fire. They can use the water from the river right next to it. Some of his guests, Mrs. Woodrow Wilson, wife of the former president, Irving Berlin, Army Generals George Marshall, George Scott, Omar Bradley, Navy Admiral Leahy, Navy Secretary of the Navy, Josiah, I can't think of his last name right now. Winston Churchill in 1932 spent some time over here, and in 1944, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was in bad health, the middle of the war, planning the D-Day invasion, his doctors told him, you need to take some time off. He said, what do you mean I need to take time off? I'm the president, we're in the middle of a war. Our citizens, they don't need to see their president taking a vacation. They said, Mr. President, your skin color is not good. Your heart rate's too high. Quit smoking those cigarettes. Go down to Florida and take a vacation. Well, Mr. Baruch, he was his financial advisor. He said, no need to go to Florida. I've got a place on Winyah Bay. I've got staff. You can go down there. You can rest on the dock. We'll have telegrams brought to you. I'll have telephones installed. Go down to my place and spend 2 weeks. Well, he came down on Easter Sunday, 1944. Train came into Georgetown. They got off the train. They got on a motorcade, came across the rivers, and they went to Hobcaw. And he was so tired, he slept the whole day. The next morning, he got up, spent some time on the dock, reading the newspapers, catching up with the war, all these things that presidents have to do. But he enjoyed himself. He was relaxed. The doctors kept checking him. His coloring had returned. Still smoking cigarettes, though, aren't you? He hadn't put down the cigarettes, but his blood pressure had gone down. His heart rate had slowed. He was feeling better. And he liked it so well, when 2 weeks were up, he said, I'm staying another 2 weeks. So we spent 4 weeks down here. It's called the greatest American secret during World War II. Nobody knew where he was. The Army and the Navy had come down several weeks before, had gone over all the water. The Navy had boats out in Winyah Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. The Marines and the Army, they were on the land as guards, sentries. Nobody knew he was here except for everybody in Georgetown. There were 3 reporters in Georgetown. The telegraph office was just going crazy. The reporters were asking people, well, what do y'all do? Oh, you fish a lot, huh? Oh, you've got a paper mill over there, huh? What about at night? The bars close up. I think in 1944 there were 9 bars in Georgetown at that time, but all the stores closed at sunset, but the bars stayed open. So they did find out that people in Georgetown did like to imbibe. But he stayed for 4 weeks. The doctors told him he looks good, so he went back to Washington, but that's one of the best kept secrets at that time. Now, Mr. Baruch and Mrs. Baruch, they had 3 children. The oldest one, Belle, she loved to hunt, she loved to fish, she was an equestrian, she was a tomboy. Anything that had to do with excitement and adventure, Belle was the one to do it. Now, Mr. Baruch, he started getting calls from developers about buying his land. He's got 16,000 acres, prime real estate. The front of it sits on the Waccamaw River, the backside sits on the Atlantic Ocean. It's larger than Manhattan and New York City. He doesn't want to sell, so his daughter says, sell it to me, Daddy, sell it to me. So he sells it to her at a low deflated price. She knows what she's got. She says, I ain't selling out to developers. So she forms an education and research trust and puts 16,000 acres in that research trust. Today, thankfully she did that. Today, the University of South Carolina and Clemson University both have research facilities on that property, and students from over 25 different colleges and universities come to HOBCALL every year and study marine biology, coastal ecology, and forest management. Thankfully to her. There's Mr. Baruch and his daughter. And I'm sure everybody knows where HOBCALL is. If you haven't visited, please plan to spend a couple of hours over there. There's no charge to go into the Discovery Center. It's right off the highway, but if you want to go back and visit the big house, there is a charge. They take you through the big house, and then you leave and you go to one of the plantation villages that still has plantation cabins, slave cemetery, and a slave chapel. Anybody recognize this handsome young man? Who? Lafayette, Marquis de Lafayette. You are right, very good. I don't know what you win, but very good. Marquis de Lafayette, he was a young 19-year-old Frenchman when we were fighting the Brits. He had a 16-year-old very pregnant wife. He tells his wife, honey, I'll be back. He doesn't tell her where he's going, why he's going, how long he's going to be gone, but he crosses the Atlantic Ocean. He wants to go into the port of Charleston. The port of Charleston is blockaded by the British. He knows Georgetown is about 65 miles north, so he goes into Georgetown, goes into North Island, where we showed you where the lighthouse was. He doesn't know how shallow or how deep the bay is to get into Georgetown. He sees these 2 black slaves digging oysters on the edge. He walks over there, he starts speaking to them in French. They don't understand French. They speak back to him in Gullah English. He doesn't understand Gullah English, but they tell him, follow, follow, follow. And they go to the home of a man who lives on North Island. Many of the plantation owners back then, during the summer months, they would take off and go to their summer home on North Island, Pawleys Island, Debadoo. Some even had second homes in the mountains of North Carolina. But this man by the name of Benjamin Huger, Huger, he was a French Huguenot who had come to America several years before. He had a home on North Island. So the 2 slaves, they took him to Benjamin Huger's home. Benjamin Huger spoke French. They conversed in French. The next day, they took the trail down to Charleston. Took them about a week to get there. About 2 weeks later, the boat came around, went into Charleston. Lafayette was wined and dined in Charleston. They said, we need to take you to Philadelphia to meet General Washington. So they made the trek to Philadelphia. Washington made him a brevet general. the youngest American general in history today, 19 years old. Lafayette helped us fight the British during the war. He survived the war. He went back home to France. Everybody held him as a hero there. Years later, he made a goodwill tour back to America. The president at that time made him an American citizen, and he told his family, when I die, I want to be buried under American soil. Well, unfortunately, he went back to France. He became old, died, and is buried in France. But while he was here on his goodwill tour, his son had collected soil from Bunker Hill battlefield. And when Lafayette died in France, his son had brought that soil back, and the first shovelfuls of dirt on his casket was American soil. So he is buried under American soil. And there's Lafayette is still revered here in Georgetown. This was Baron de Kalb. He was a German. He came to, thank you, darling.
You're welcome.
Y'all excuse me, this is tobacco she just gave me. A plug. Baron de Kalb came to America, or the colony, with Lafayette. Unfortunately, he was killed in the Battle of Camden. But in Georgetown, on the front of the Rice Museum town clock, there is a large plaque put up by the DAR many years ago to help us celebrate Marquis de Lafayette's landing. First place he put his foot on American soil was here in Georgetown County. Now let's talk about the rice industry, called Carolina Gold. Indigo was a good cash crop until the American Revolutionary War. We beat the British. The British no longer wanted to buy indigo from a former colony, so that cash crop took a dive. The planters were growing rice at that same time, and rice became even a more prosperous crop than indigo. Now rice, it was a lot more involved than the indigo. You had to have the rice fields, you had to have the irrigation from the rivers, fresh water, not salt water. A lot of work goes into keeping a rice plantation. Now, rice was so good here in Georgetown County. Now here's the South Santee and the North Santee River on your left. This is South Georgetown. They flow into the Atlantic Ocean. Now Highway 17, here's Hopsawee Plantation. So Highway 17 goes right along here and into the city. Now Georgetown is actually 12 miles inland from Winyah Bay. So here's Winyah Bay. Here's the city of Georgetown. This is the Sampit River that runs behind Georgetown. And then here's the Black River, the PD, and the Waccamaw. Now all these names you see listed are the names of the 150 rice plantations that we had in Georgetown County at that time. Now rice made the planters very, 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 very wealthy until the war between the states, the American Civil War. At that time, we lost, the plantation owners no longer had the labor force to continue producing rice. You can still see some of these names today: Waterford, Hagley, True Blue, Midway, Caledonia, Waverly, Litchfield, Willbrook, the Oaks, Brook Green. 15 of the golf courses we have here in Georgetown County were at one time former rice plantations. Now, you needed slaves to work the rice plantation. Joshua John Ward, he owned present-day Brook Green Gardens. When he died, he had close to 1,100 slaves. The largest slave owner in South Carolina and America was right here in Georgetown County. Now, speaking of slaves, in Africa, 12 million Africans left Africa on a boat going to a different place. 2 million of those 12 million died in what they call the Middle Passage. So that left 10 million that left the continent of Africa to different places. Now, out of those 10 million, how many do you think came to America?
1 million.
Any guesses?
1 million.
I can't hear. My ears are old.
8 million.
8 million? Out of that 10 million, 400,000 came to America. So that left 9,600,000 that went to South America, the Caribbean, the West Indies. The South Carolina Maritime Museum on Front Street in Georgetown, they've got an excellent display of the slave trade, the routes, and a lot more information than I can share with you today about that slave trade. Very educational, and I'm not proud to say, every nation has a warts and bad parts of their history, and this is not a good part of our history, but so much of it has been politicized, and we're all acute with white guilt. We're all guilty of slaves, but we didn't have slaves. Nobody in the room had slaves. But I just wanted to make you aware that only 400,000 of 10 million came to America. The first black congressman in U.S. Congress was from Georgetown, Joseph Haynes Rainey. He was elected to Congress in 1876, I believe, and he served Georgetown well. After Congress, he became a state senator in the state of South Carolina. It'd help if I punched the right one instead of the red one. But his house is still standing in Georgetown. It's on Prince Street. There's a historical marker. It's called the Rainey Camlin House. There's a historical marker in front honoring him with that for a well-deserved acclamation for serving our nation. Has anybody ever seen this flag? Anybody know who designed it? Christopher Gadsden. He was a revolutionary person. He was from, I won't want to say he's from South Carolina, but he had homes in Charleston. He had a home in Georgetown on the Black River, Benevenum Plantation. He also owned 4 lots on Prince Street. But he designed the flag that became the symbol for the American Revolutionary War. This is Mr. Gadsden right there. This is his home in Benevenum Plantation, like I told you, on the Black River. The Harvest Moon. The Harvest Moon was the United States flagship, the flagship of the U.S. Navy during the American Civil War, the war between the states. The Harvest Moon was 193 feet in length and 29 feet in width. Its admiral, or its captain, was Admiral John Dahlgren. Now, the Harvest Moon was stationed in Charleston during the war, and its job, it was part of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. And the job of the squadron was to blockade the ports of Savannah, Charleston, and Georgetown to keep Confederate ships from coming in or going out. Now, the USS Harvest Moon was in Charleston when Charleston surrendered. Admiral Dahlgren on the Harvest Moon heard that Georgetown was ready to surrender. So the Harvest Moon left Charleston, came up the coast, went into Winyah Bay, 12 miles into the city of Georgetown. He docked right behind the town clock. He went in the town clock. It was City Hall at that time. He accepted the surrender of the city officials and declared that all slaves in Georgetown County are now free. He got back on the boat. It was too late to go back to Charleston, so he said, "We will anchor right out here in Winyah Bay." Well, they spent the night in Winyah Bay. The next morning, March 1st, 1865, he gives the order, "Let's go to Charleston." So the crew, they go down below, they fire up the boilers, they get the side wheelers going, and off they go. He goes down below to the galley to write his report about Georgetown surrendering. A steward puts a cup of coffee in front of him and says, "Sir, I'll have your breakfast in 5 minutes." Admiral Dahlgren says, "That's fine, I've got to write this report, no hurry." What he did not know, the crew did not know, but 2 men, 2 nights before, in the building next door to the town clock, the old Kaminsky Hardware building, they had built these mines. They built about 13 mines. They took a wooden cask, a barrel, emptied the contents out of it, filled it full of gunpowder, and at night on an outgoing tide, they floated those mines out in the bay about 2 feet under the water. And then they went back home. Well, March 1st, 1865, after he gives the order, "Let's go to Charleston," they take off. 5 minutes later, guess what? The USS Harvest Moon, the flagship of the U.S. Navy, guess what it hits? Bam! it hits one of those mines. Well, the crew thought a boiler had blown up, so they went rushing down below. They could smell the gunpowder, and they knew exactly what it was. The steward who had just put a cup of coffee in front of Admiral Dahlgren, he was laid out on the floor dead from the explosion. And there was a big 10 by 12 foot hole in the starboard side with water just gushing in. And Admiral Dahlgren, he's scratching his head, dadgummit. 6 hours ago, everything was fine, peaceful surrender. And now 6 hours later, our boat is sinking in the pluff mud. It was only in 15 feet of water. They tried for 2 months to raise that ship, repair that hole, and keep it going. But the damage had been too extensive. Is that Santa Claus coming or what? The damage was too extensive. He had to write the Secretary of the Navy, "Sir, I regret to inform you, but the USS Harvest Moon has been a casualty of a Confederate mine and is sitting on the bottom of Winyaw Bay. The only U.S. Navy flagship ever sunk by a Confederate mine." This was the building. It's right next door to the town clock where the mines were made. This is what the mine looked like. That's the boat sinking. And today at low tide, if you go out into Winyaw Bay, you can see the top of the smokestack from that ship where it sank over 150 years ago. In 1964, the U.S. Navy sent divers to Georgetown to dive on that ship to see if it could be raised for the centennial. They spent about a week diving on the ship. They discovered it was covered in 10 feet of pluff mud above it, around it, below it, beside it, and in it. They also determined it was going to cost too much money to raise, and that's when the Navy relinquished ownership and gave it to the state of South Carolina. But there it sits, 150 some odd years later, still the only U.S. Navy flagship ever sunk by a Confederate mine. Now, I know these cowboys, none of them look familiar, but the man on your right, his name was Tom Yawkey. He was the owner of the Boston Red Sox for 44 years, and he inherited 20,000 acres of prime real estate on the Winyaw Bay and the coast of South Carolina. He used it for hunting and fishing. And he enjoyed it so much that before he died, here it is right here, all this in green. Here's the lighthouse right here. Georgetown's up here. And this is North Island. Hobcaw would be right here. This is North Inlet. Then you're going up here to Debadoo and Pawleys Island. But he's got 20,000 acres of land, and developers are calling him every day. "Hey, you want to sell your property? Whatever you offered me yesterday, she just said she will double." This lady right here, she's going to double both of those. "You want to sell?" "Nah, not today." He gets all these calls, all these letters, solicitations. He finally gets so fed up with the developers, he said, "Look, this land's not for sale. It will never be sold, and it won't be sold to a commercial developer." So in 1976, he died, and before he died, he willed 20,000 acres of prime coastal real estate to the state of South Carolina to be used for education and research. So here we have more protection from all the development that's happening north and south of us. So Georgetown has some protection so we will not be overrun with development like some of these other places. Oh, let's back up. All right, I mentioned the Sunset Lodge earlier. That sign, the actual Sunset Lodge never had a sign. People who went there just knew where it was. It was on Highway 17 South, about 3 miles south of Georgetown, right before you get to the airport on the left. But the Sunset Lodge, Tom Yawkey, the man we just talked about who owned the Boston Red Sox, he was one of the financiers to get the Sunset Lodge cranked up and running. It opened in Georgetown in 1936. It closed in Georgetown in 1969. 33 years we had a brothel in Georgetown, went through 3 different sheriffs. It was one of the most in the late 1940s, early 1950s, Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor opened as a tourist attraction. Fort Sumter was the largest tourist attraction in South Carolina. Guess what was the second largest? Right there, Sunset Lodge. And there's a book David Hodges wrote a book several years ago. If you want to know more about the Sunset Lodge, I would suggest getting his book, Sunset Lodge, Story of a Madam. I'm sure all of us are at this age where we instantly recognize that sign, Tideland's Health. Well, in 1945, people in Georgetown were soliciting funds to build a hospital in Georgetown. The closest one was in Conway. Tom Yawkey, they asked him for a donation. He wrote them a check for $300,000. He was a wealthy individual. $300,000 in today's money is equivalent to $4.5 million. The hospital was finished in 1950. They named a wing after Mr. Yawkey. It's still called Yawkey Surgery Pavilion today. He and his wife in 1970, they established an orphanage out on the Black River called Terra Hall. It was in operation until COVID several years ago. It's now some type of a academy or some type of school. But before Georgetown had a hospital, we had a lady by the name of Florence Williams. She was a registered nurse in Georgetown, and from 1925 to 1954, she had a small hospital with 2 wards and 25 beds, and she treated black and white. Didn't make any difference. But we have to honor her for what she did for the people of Georgetown at that time. The Hussar, the largest privately owned yacht in the world, was built in Germany in the mid-1930s. It was owned by E.F. Hutton and his wife, Marjorie Meriwether Post. Now, they were very wealthy. Here they are there with their daughter, Dina Merrill. Dina died several years ago. But things weren't as happy in their marriage as it looks in this picture. And they came to Georgetown in their boat and left it in Georgetown for several years while the divorce proceedings were going on. This is the Kaminsky house back here, and this is the Parker Stewart house back here. This was the wharf there on Front Street. When the divorce was finalized, Mrs. Post, she got the boat. She changed the name from the Hussar to the Sea Cloud. During World War II, either the Coast Guard or the Navy took over the operation of the boat and used it for military maneuvers. Today, it's a very nice yacht that sells the Mediterranean. You can Google Sea Cloud and see how much the rooms are, and send us a postcard whenever you hit port. Speaking of ships in Georgetown, Georgetown back in the late 1800s, early 1900s had 5 lumber mills. Atlantic Coast Lumber was the largest on the East Coast, and these big ships used to come in, load lumber, take it up north for the building boom. Also, Anna Hyatt Huntington, just north of here is Brook Green Gardens. She and Mr. Huntington bought some property. She wanted a sculpture garden. Today, you all know Brook Green Gardens. Thankfully for their benevolency, we still have that place today. You all recognize the Fighting Stallions when you go in. Now, I know we've been going on for about 30 minutes. We've filled your head with a lot of information. I see it coming out your ear, ma'am. You're not going to remember everything we said today, so you may want to go home and take a double dose of Prevagen. It will sort of stimulate your memory, but we've come to the end of the program. We do have 2 commercials, Prevagen, and if anybody wants to go on a walking tour, we do offer walking tours in Georgetown. It's a 90-minute tour. It costs us $20 each. We have a historical tour, and we started something this year following the footsteps of Francis Marion. So we thank y'all for being here today. Y'all have been a good audience. I'll be glad to answer any questions you may have. If not, y'all can get up and do what you need to do. But by George, now you know. Okie dokie? All right, thank y'all.
Thank you to Paige, and I did want to say thank you to our friends of the Waccamaw Library. I know we have Diane Stern, our president of our Friends organization, and Carol Lice back there, who provided drinks for us if you want to get those before you leave. But they make this program possible and all our programs possible here. But how about any questions for Paige.
Yes, ma'am.
So you opened this up with that very,
Wait a minute, I got to get close to you.
hello.
Hello.
You opened it up with the poem. I've asked Bud Hill numerous times, whatever happened to Billy Baldwin's application for poet laureate?
I don't know. I know Billy down in McClellanville,
Yep.
but I don't know. I guess Archibald Rutledge took preference, but I don't know. I don't know, yeah. I don't know.
Okay.
It's still, the governor
Yes,
has
sir.
to sign off on that, so we're still waiting.
I was of the opinion that kerosene and turpentine was a big cash crop also for the lumber produced.
Yes, sir.
generated.
A lot of turpentine was produced in Horry County.
Okay.
Now, Horry County, I don't want to keep y'all, but Horry County, nobody wanted to settle in Horry County because of the beach. Nobody wanted, but you couldn't grow crops on the beach. So they started producing turpentine, from all the pine trees, and a lot of the shipbuilding happened on the PD River. The Waccamaw, going up towards Conway. And the turpentine was a big industry. In fact, I can't think of the name of it. Every now and then I will find tar. Pitch. I will find some solidified pitch that came off of a ship, washed up on the beach. It's hardened. It's sort of amber, dark amber in color, but it'll be bits and pieces. But you find that every now and then. But yeah, turpentine was a big industry back in the 1900s. Yes, ma'am.
Was the name of George Washington's physician in Philadelphia James McHenry?
I'm not sure.
Okay, because I know that he was Secretary of War, and he was also
Right.
he was his physician during and he was based out of Philadelphia for a while.
All right.
So I was just
See this
wondering-
lady? She just brought us some good information right here.
That's
So-
because I'm Karen McHenry Glantz.
Okay, all right, well, good.
I just-
Well, see, little tidbits like that, they add to the overall story. So thank you. Tom, did you have a question?
No, sir.
All right, I thought I saw another hand. Anybody else? Thank y'all very much. Thank you for your questions. That were great. Thank y'all.